Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my book review of the massive book, Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. This is the absolutely long and massive historical fiction novel by Ken Follett that I had picked up months and months ago and had been intending to read, but just hadn't gotten to it yet. I have a fear of picking up tomes because I'm afraid it's going to take me a while to read them, and I'm kind of worried that that it'll like derail my reading and cause a bunch of problems. Well, it's all kind of funny the way this happened because I had, because of my school musical and because of other things in life, had basically stopped reading for about 2 weeks, which is entirely unlike me. However, I picked up Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth, which in retrospect, I'm like, why did I do that? Anyway, and I read it in 3 days. And it's 1,000 pages with, pretty small print. It's pretty small print here, but I was able to read it that fast, which was very surprising. And the reason I was able to read it that fast is 2 reasons. One, I had spring break. My school that I teach at is on spring break, which helps. The other reason is it's a fantastic and absolutely engrossing story. I picked this book up primarily because 2 book reviewers that I follow gave this glowing marks. One, Mike from Mike's Book Reviews recently reread it, and he talked about how amazing it was. And then Brian Lee Durfee is a huge Ken Follett fan, and Brian Lee Durfee is constantly going on about how great Pillars of the Earth is. And so I was like, all right, I'll give it a chance. Sometimes Brian's recommendations work, sometimes they don't. Definitely worked this time. And so I picked it up. I knew it was about building a cathedral in England, but I didn't know how readable the book would be. And that's the word that I will give this book is engrossing. You are absolutely engrossed from the beginning of the book. It is so fascinating. The character journeys, the plot, the hurdles that went through the characters. This book is historical fiction, but I absolutely believe that fans of epic fantasy will enjoy this. And actually, I think that's part of the reason I enjoyed it. I've been saying for a while that I've wanted us to get fantasy books with like that kind of medieval setting, but put less emphasis, or in this case, no emphasis on the magic, and put all the emphasis on the kind of political storyline and the religious and the characters and whatnot. And that's exactly what this book does. It's exactly what this book does. And so I really enjoyed that. If you're a fan of medieval times and the Middle Ages, you'll absolutely find this book riveting. And as I said, it's readable. The character dialogue is so interesting. The character journeys are so interesting. And the story itself moves at a surprisingly fast pace for being 1,000 pages long. You are really invested in the characters. Even the characters you don't like or the characters that frustrate you, you're still invested in them. And that is just such a strong element of this book. I do want to touch on the religious themes of the book because that is a very, very interesting element to the book. Ken Follett, at the beginning of the book, at the very beginning in the preface of this edition, talks about how he is not a Christian, he is an atheist. However, he writes Christian characters, writes religious leaders in his book, and he wanted to kind of explore that from his perspective. And it's if he hadn't told us, the reader, that he was an atheist, I think you would have figured it out based off of the book, because I do believe that the book is very clearly pushing an atheistic worldview, but focusing on religious characters while doing it. So in this book, really, I did not like the characterizations of Christians because I felt like he didn't understand the heart of Christianity. I would say that Philip comes really close, and in fact I would say Philip is probably the one character in the book Prior Philip, who is is a good representation of Christianity. But just about every other character present, I think, is a bad representation and represents the absolute worst elements, the absolute worst things. And some of the characters, it's like they're Christians, but they're not even following the precepts and tenets of Christianity. I'm not talking about the religious and classic traditions. I'm talking about the belief systems and the basic basic ideals of the religion. And so it's very frustrating to have characters that are so different from how the religion actually is. And that was a little frustrating for me. But still, I was still engrossed by the story, which tells you that it's such a well-crafted book that I highly disagree with the way things were portrayed, and I still was so enraptured by the book and so interested by the stories it told. And when I talk about the religious stuff, I would actually compare this to the novel Elantris by Brandon Sanderson, because both books deal with themes about religious characters trying to build something out of what's really a bad situation. It's also religious characters having to deal with the questions of their religion and having to deal with people who have different beliefs than them. And both books have to deal with how is religion important to society as a whole. And they come up with, in my opinion, two different answers. And Elantris is my favorite novel of all time. But Elantris, very clearly from Brandon Sanderson, who is a religious person himself, very much points in one direction towards the importance of religion in society and the importance of following that worldview, whereas Ken Follett's obviously shows the depravity of life and shows perhaps the negative elements of religion, which I disagree with him on. But so it's just so interesting that this book, I would describe it as the antithesis of Elantris in that way. So if you're someone who really finds religious discussion fascinating in books, you should probably pick this up. However, I would also compare this to another fantasy classic, and probably a bigger fantasy classic, and that is Game of Thrones, or for the purists out there, A Song of Ice and Fire. A Song of Ice and Fire and the Game of Thrones series, both the TV and books, really show a couple of things. One, they show great political and character storylines in this kind of medieval-like setting. And Game of Thrones has magic and is fantastical, but it also is less so than other fantasy series in some ways. But that series really shows humanity, depravity at its worst. I think that Mike from Mike's Book Reviews said that this book is real life grimdark, and Game of Thrones is one of the originators of the grimdark genre, and this definitely has that same. Even though this came out before, it has that same type of feel. So I would say for sure, if you're a Game of Thrones fan, you will absolutely eat this book up. You will love this book. It's very interesting, and it really gets that grimdark feeling well. I'm just not the biggest grimdark fan myself in some ways. But anyway, so it is, as I said, this is, if you love fantasy, epic fantasy, I think that you will really enjoy this book, despite the fact that there's nothing fantastical about it. It's all just normal type characters. From the war perspective, there are a few battles. There's some civil wars going on in this book. And normally, fantasy books, you have a few characters who are smaller, like foot soldiers or something, but usually you see the war from the perspective of the kings or the generals or the leaders involved. Here, you see it almost entirely from the perspective of the average citizens who aren't fighting. You see it from the religious monk's perspective. You see it from the townspeople, and maybe a knight here or there is present. But I think that the book is so interesting because it tells that war story from these other people's perspectives. And by the way, like Game of Thrones, this book has devastating and just completely shocking character deaths, and one in particular at the end of part 3 that I'm still not over. The character death at the end of part 3 I thought was horrifying and sad, and just it gave me, this wasn't on the level as many characters dying as the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones, but it gave me the same feeling that I had when I first read/watched the Red Wedding. Going into other things, when it comes to characters, there's some great character work and great theme work with the characters in this book. You have Tom Builder, one of my favorite characters in the book, who is having just the worst luck with his life, yet all he wants to do is build a cathedral. You have the character of Ellen, who is this single woman raising her son, and she finally thinks she's found the love of her life, but she realizes how difficult being with this man will be. You also have the character of Prior Philip, who is the one and only purely morally good character, and yet he still has a few elements of Machiavellian tactics to his character. But you have Prior Philip, who is just trying to help the people out of Kingsbridge, while also trying to build the castle in Kingsbridge. And then you have the absolutely repugnant, horrifying, evil William Hamley. William Hamley is a superb villain here. You just instantly hate him. You think you hate Umbridge from the Harry Potter universe if you've read the Harry Potter books. You know that seething hatred you have for her. William is like that, but he's worse than Umbridge. Yes, because it's an adult book, it's grimdark. He is worse than Umbridge. You just seethingly hate him, and you just want to see him meet a vile, horrible end. And I thought that the character work was just so well done on that. And I didn't like where. And then of course you have Alenia, however you pronounce that, who is a character who is, does not want to marry William, and she also has these other love interests going on. And you have Jack, who just is kind of confused by life, and he's pulled in all these different directions. And the character work, I was engrossed in every story. There was not a story in this book, a character story, where I said, I'm not interested in this, I just want to skip it. No, I was interested in all of them. Even the bad guys or the more sniveling guys, the sneaky guys like Whaler and Bigod, however you pronounce his name, he was interesting. King Henry, King Stephen, they were interesting. All of these types of characters, even all of them were really fascinating to me to read about. And also, of course, this book is about the building of the cathedral. And the building of the cathedral shows up throughout the book. And it's, the book's framed around the building of the cathedral. And the book takes place over decades of time. However, the building of the cathedral is not as central as you might expect. You might think that you're going to just read pages and pages and pages of how they laid this brick and how they built this and how they... That stuff's layered throughout, but it never felt like you were just reading a textbook on how to build a cathedral, even though all of that element is there. Instead, it felt like just a really compelling character journey and story journey where all these little storylines are going on, and the cathedral is just the touchstone of understanding at what point in the building of the cathedral they're at, which I just thought was utterly fantastic. There is a big red flag elephant in the room regarding this book, and that is the way that it deals with sexual assault and things like that. And some people will say, well, that's just what the time frame was, and there was an evil time frame, and there were evil people at that time. And I understand that from a perspective. And there's also, you could say, well, this, and then just not the assaults part, just the raw sexual elements in the book. You could say, well, that's just, part of life. That's just something that people do and things like that. There's a difference between portraying people and portraying life, and then also going out of your way to explicitly show things and going out of your way to try to describe these sequences. You can demonstrate that a character is doing something wrong. You can demonstrate that a character is living a certain way without going into the gruesome and meticulous detail. There is one sequence in here that I feel like that stuff could be argued that it was kind of justified for, but almost every other time that stuff was in this book, which was throughout the book. It's throughout the book, and it's random at places. But whenever that stuff was there, I was like, you could have demonstrated the characters doing these immoral things or going down bad paths without going the explicit route. And so this book is like rated R. Could be like, if they were ratings like this could be rated X in some ways. But I think that it didn't need to be. And that is the one area where I will knock the book in points. Even the stuff on the religious stuff where I highly disagree with the worldview that Ken Follett portrays and the way he deals with Christians, I still won't dock him points because it was so fascinating the way he did that. I will dock him points for the absolutely unnecessary and constant explicit nature of the book. There's so many, if you took that stuff out there, I'd be like, this is a book I have to recommend to everyone. And now I don't feel comfortable doing that because of the stuff that's in this book, and that is very frustrating. And again, people with different worldviews will probably disagree with me on that, but to me, I'm like, you do not need to make things explicit like that and as common. There's a difference between like making like a scene explicit and making the book like that, which was just frustrating. That being said, moving away from that negative, moving back to another positive, when it comes to the word I'll use here is world building. And I know that you're going to be like, this is just history, but stick with me. If you're reading fantasy, you know where I'm going with this. The world building in this book was superb. Like when they were talking about the different types of foods that they would eat, the different types of armor that they had, the weapons, and they talked about the different coinage that they would use and the way that they lived and the different types of serfs and peasants and all that stuff. I was eating that up because the history teacher / Middle Ages fan, like my favorite period of history to teach about for world history is the Middle Ages. So I'm really fascinated by all that, and I think that Ken Follett just knocked that out of the park. This is a book where I loved reading the book. In almost every single element, Ken Follett gets perfect marks. I mean, on story, perfect marks. Character, perfect marks. On themes, I disagree with the themes in the book, but he gets perfect marks because they were so interesting and so fascinating to me. And then also the world building gets perfect marks. The pacing of the book, I think, gets perfect marks because this book is paced beautifully. I also think that the readability of this book is one of the best I can give for a book. So in so many categories, this book is getting perfect marks, but it is brought down by just that one thing of the explicit nature that just keeps me from giving it that perfect rating. So I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10, which is still a hugely high rating, but I just have to warn you, boy, is this book explicit. Boy, is it explicit. So I'm warning you about that going into it. But when you understand that, the themes and the ideas here are just so fantastically expertly done. So if you've read The Pillars of the Earth, let me know your thoughts. Do you think that he handles Christianity well? Do you think he understands the heart of it? Do you think that he understands the Middle Ages well? Did you like the action and the stories? Who is your favorite character? And did the character death at the end of part 3 mess you up like it did me? Because, boy, that character death, I'm still not over it. Let me know all those thoughts in the comments section down below. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.